Let's begin our investigation into one-dimensional kinematics by looking at the motion of a car that moves at constant speed. So if you have access to a car that will move at constant speed and not too fast, if it's moving too fast, that makes it a lot harder to measure. But if you have access to a car, measuring device, and a stopwatch, I highly recommend doing the lab for yourself so that you can have the tangible experience of touching the car and observing it with your own eyes and not just going by what I have on the screen. If you don't, then you're limited by what you have access to. And I will go through the lab and then provide my data, and you can skip ahead to making the graphs in Google Sheets, that part of the video, and walk through analyzing my data along with me. But if you have your own data, that's even better. So let's set up, and if you have access to these things, you can set up your materials and your space for yourself. This is my setup here. I've put down pieces of tape on the floor. That piece of tape that's closest to the front lab table is going to be my starting line. And each subsequent piece of tape is 1/2 meter apart. So when I time this, I'm going to start my car here at the starting line, and I'm going to time it 3 times to that first piece of tape and write down each of my times. That first piece of tape is 1/2 meter. So let's do that. You want it to be moving at constant speed before you start timing it. Start it back here, and when it reaches the starting line, I'll start my stopwatch. All right, for each time, I'm going to write down the distance, and I'm measuring it in meters. If you have a different measuring device that does maybe inches instead, maybe you'll be doing it in feet instead of in meters. But it will work best if you have 6 distances to work from. And each distance you need to measure 3 times. And you need to make sure that you clear your stopwatch. And then you write down each of your times, and once you've measured 3 times for each distance, then you move on to the next distance. All right, I've done 3 times for that distance, so now I will let it roll for a longer distance. Make sure you clear the stopwatch first. All right, I'll do the rest of these off the screen, and then I'll type them in to my document, and we'll skip to analyzing the data in Google Sheets by making graphs. All right, we have our data. Here's my data in red over here on the right. And we have our Google Sheets up. So we'll name it out for a drive. And we'll type our data that we need into the Google Sheets. Start with distance, and I measured that in meters. If you measured it in feet, then you'll put the units up there. Notice that I'm just typing the numbers here, and I'm not typing the units in with the numbers. I'm just putting the units up at the top. Then we'll have time, average, and we did that in seconds. All right. And I'm going to want to make a velocity versus time graph also. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to type a formula into here because the velocity that I want is going to be the velocity between each adjacent distance over that time. So we're going to type in a formula here, and we want it in the velocity there. So we're going to subtract these two distances, and we're always going to get a half a meter when we subtract those guys. But the times are going to be adjusted slightly based on what we actually measured. And the nice thing about Google Sheets is that you type in the formula once and it will offer to copy that down to fill that in. Let's do that. Now, this is way too many decimal points. I only want 2 decimal points. So let's reduce that down. That makes it easier to read. Notice that I have left the top one blank, and that's because you have to have a distance over which you've covered, and at 0 distance, you've covered nothing yet. So from 0 to 0.5, we've gone a time of 0 to 1.26, and that gets us a velocity of 0.4. And then we're going to do the same thing with 0.5 to 1, and then 1.26 to 2.4, and then that gets us that speed as well. Now, in order to make a graph, we're going to need to highlight those columns that we want to put in the graph. So I want to do a distance versus time graph first. I'm going to come up here to Insert, and Google Sheets calls it a chart, so we'll choose Chart here. And now that I've typed in my data, I don't need that, so I can spread out this guy. And this is a bar graph. I don't want to have a bar graph, or a column chart they're calling it. I want to have a scatter plot. And I want to have distance on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. Now, I do understand that normally we would want to put the variable that you chose on the x-axis. Well, I chose the distances, so normally we would want to put that on the x-axis. But for analysis here, I want to have time on the x-axis. So I'm going to switch these guys. Series, I want to have, oh, here we go, series. I want to have that be a distance, and we're going to remove the time. I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to add an x-axis for time. So I've switched those guys. And I'm also going to need to switch my axis label. So you can click on that, and it will jump over to vertical axis title. Vertical axis title, I don't want that. I want distance. And I measured that there. And then I come up here to the drop down, and we do horizontal axis title. And that will be time. And now we're customizing it. You can close that. There's one more thing that I want to do. We need to fix the title also. Chart title is not time versus distance. It is distance versus time. It is always going to be the vertical axis versus the horizontal axis. And I want to add one more thing. I want to add a best fit trend line. So still in Customize, you come to Series and you scroll down to Trend Line. And the default is linear. And I want to label it with an equation. And they will tell us there we have the equations where this is the vertical, x is the horizontal, and then they filled in the numbers here that are specific situation here. Now let's put this to its own sheet. There we go, we put it to its own sheet. And now let's go make a time velocity versus time graph. And we're going to go through the same process, chart, and this time they have very nicely done time on the x, velocity on the y, proper that. And usually when you fix the first graph, the second graph will be consistent. And then we can come over here to Customize because the graph has been built correctly for us. It's a scatter plot. We don't have to fix that either. Type in the trend line. And we're going to use the equation again. And we can close the chart editor. And then we can move this to its own sheet. And now we have chart 1, which if you want to label it, you can double click on that. And that's not what I wanted to happen. There we go. Distance versus time, and then we can double click on this, and that'll be velocity versus time. And we can switch back and forth between them. And now you can use these to, or you should use your own if you have your own lab equipment. If you don't have your own lab equipment, you can use these graphs to answer the analysis questions that are on page 2 of the lab sheet. So print that out and look at these graphs and use these graphs to answer the questions on the analysis. And then we will use these graphs and that analysis as we develop our understanding of kinematics, as well as the equations of motion that we're going to get off of these graphs.